Like it. Nice to meet you. Andrew's on Teams.
And here's some not in anybody's way. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for coming to this flood hazard mitigation meeting. And I know a few people in the crowd here, so that's comforting for me to know. And first thing, I just want to acknowledge that this meeting is respectfully held on the territory of the Nechako First Nation, on whose land every lives in place. And I'm a retired flood hazard officer for 40-some years, and I've attended most floods in north half of BC and some in southern half of BC as well. So lots of experience in flooding, and I'm enjoying retirement. And every once in a while I get asked to do these kinds of things, so I always count it a privilege to share knowledge and to learn more. And I'm always learning stuff all the time too. So basically, how we like the meeting to work, we've got 5 presentations to make. So I'll do the first one, and next we'll have Rio Tinto with Andrew and Amon, and Ian Leslie, your fire chief, and Wayne Selesky, and Mayor Kevin Mutri. And congratulations on successfully becoming the mayor. And then I'll just close off. So if everyone is okay with that, I'll just start it off with my presentation, and hopefully make something out of it. So we're going to talk about flood hazard management. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to cover these topics. We'll just do a little bit of freshet history and ice jam history, and just talk a little bit about managing the Nechako floodplain. And then we'll end off with the pillars of emergency management. So we go to the next slide. It's always a good idea to have an idea of the layout of the watershed first, so we know what we're looking at. And the entire area of the watershed is over 47,000 square kilometers. And the area that, of course, that we're most interested in here is upstream of Vanderhoof. 56% of it is regulated, covering 13,997 square kilometers. And that's regulated with the reservoir. Then there's the unregulated part, about 44%, and that covers about 11,231 square kilometers. And these areas have come from the provincial water mapping tool. Next slide. So we know from history that one of the characteristics of the Nechako River is that it historically flooded almost every year. And that was even noted back, as you can see, as far back as 1920 from some of the records that we've got. And so it nearly flooded every year to varying degrees. Next slide. And that's even acknowledged by Water Survey of Canada, who installed the gauging station here at Vanderhoof in the 1940s. So there were 4 floods in a row, 1949, 50, 51, and 1952. And then the reservoir was, shall we say, activated. And shortly thereafter, there was a flood in 1958, another one in 1964. And then there was a more significant flood in 1976. Then there was about a 31-year gap where we didn't see any spring flooding for 31 years, which was rather remarkable, actually. Until the next flood occurred in 2007, and that was our most significant flood, the most significant recent flood. We had lots of fun with that one. And then the last freshet flood was was in 2015. So for the last 7 years, we haven't seen any spring flood events, so we've been very fortunate. So essentially, there was 5 flood events in the past 70 years, which is quite remarkable. And when I took a look at the snowpack data, there was many years where the snowpack was well above normal, and there was potential for at least 35 flood events or even more. So that's something to think about, having a reservoir in the watershed. Next slide. So let's just take a look at the 2 most significant events starting in 1976. Here's the South Shore. Development was occurring on Riverview Drive and Victoria Street East. And the flow of that day in May 6 was 705 cubic meters per second. And the river peaked about 3 days later at 745 cubic meters per second. And you can see the amount of area that was inundated. Next slide. And if we move up to the 2007 flood event, looking at the South Shore from a little different angle, sandbags were installed and Hescogabian baskets also installed. And despite that, there was still flooding on the landslide, or on the land side, clearly showing the porous nature of the soils. Next slide. Then if we take a look at the South Shore in 1976, or sorry, the North Shore, I'm getting my shores mixed around here. Again, the flow was 705 cubic meters per second, and the river flowed from right to left, and there was a lot of back flooding that inundated the fields there and overtop Reed Drive, and as you can see, subdivision development was occurring. And then moving up to the 2007 flood, next slide, looking at it from a little different angle, an earth berm was installed and Hescogabian baskets as well. So looking at these four photographs, it's very clear that a river needs space to accommodate that extra volume of water. That's very clear. And so this is space that the river needs to accommodate water because the gradient of the river is so flat. Next slide. Interestingly, the River Forecast Center produced a hydrograph of the 2007 flood. And they calculated what the flow could have been or would have been if there was no reservoir. And that flow would have nearly reached 1,500 cubic meters per second, which is well above the 200-year flood. So in that case, the flood would have been extreme and catastrophic. And I'm going to show you an example of a catastrophic flood later on. And so instead, the river was held down to a flood level of just slightly less than a 50-year flood. A 50-year flood, in my view, is a moderate flood, but it's still pretty serious. And a flood anything greater than a 200-year flood is pretty catastrophic. And if we take a look at the right side of the slide there, the reason for all this water was that very heavy snowpack. So on April 1st, you can see it was 159% of normal, May 1st, 164% of normal. And then by May 15th, the snowpack was almost double. And there was a bit of a lake melt, and that water came off really fast, hence the high water. Right. One thing about this water course is that when flooding does occur, it seems to last for a while. And if we take a look at the 1976 flood, shown on the blue line there, Vanderhoof was underwater for 15 days in May and another 5 days in June. And then during the 2007 flood event, Vanderhoof was underwater for 56 days. That was a long flood event, and boy, we had to do a lot of work that year. And then just as a note of interest, the 2015 flood lasted for 27 days. So that's just another characteristic of this watercourse being so flat. It takes a while for the water to pass through. It simply cannot pass through quickly within the confines of the channel. It just won't do that. So it needs that extra floodway space in order to accommodate flood flows. And this is something that needs to really be emphasized. So let's move on to ice jam flooding. And we know for sure there are 4 recorded events. The most significant one was in November 1996. And we'll go to the next slide. And the estimated flow was about 170 cubic meters per second. And then on December 07, 135 cubic meters per second. And then 2 years ago, our most recent ice jam flood in January 2021 was estimated at 118 cubic meters per second. I'll be talking more about that in a bit. And then there was another flood event, ice jam flood event in November 2005 that was recorded at 116 cubic meters per second. Those are the water flows, the estimated water flows. What we do know for sure from recent years that when the river flow is less than 60 cubic meters per second, there's no flood threat. And I'll have a number for you for today's water level in a little bit. In any case, it begs the question, where is that flood flow threshold? where is that going to be set? And I believe that might be worked on by a consultant. We go to the next slide. I did a bit of research back to 1980, and I discovered that there were 9 times when the river flow was greater than 60 cubic meters per second, up to 116 cubic meters per second. So there's quite a range of flows there. What we don't know is whether or not there was any flooding in those years. And I can't seem to find records on that. And so if anybody here has lived along the river, which I'm sure you have since the 1990s, I would invite you to come talk to me afterwards and just if you can recollect if there was flooding on any one of these years or not, whether there was flooding or not is all good information for the consultant to know who is updating the floodplain mapping. So I would just invite you to talk to me afterwards, and we can, if you have some anecdotal information, that is fantastic. Because we seem to really be short on records when it comes to ice jams. Okay. So if we go to the next slide, our most recent ice jam was in January 2021. That affected the Campbell Road subdivision. And I have identified those properties as 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I have the red arrows pointing down to the consultant's ice jam hazard map, just so you can see where these properties fit in on the mapping. If you take a look at the blue color coding, there's a potential for flooding in those back channels and side channels on the bottom side. And of course, flooding for the buildings might take a little higher flow, but right at the moment, we're targeting 60 cubic meters per second to be on the safe side. Next slide.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Do we know, Kevin, when that subdivision was approved, what the flood level was? Was it 50, 100, 200?
Well, my time in Indian.
No, I don't. The only thing that I can come up with on that property down there, that it was zoned to be used for agriculture use to grow vegetables, is when that subdivision was approved for.
So I think it's important from a community standpoint to understand the approval time period to see if we made a mistake, acknowledge the existing issue that's there, right?
Yeah.
I think in fairness to the taxpayer, if we screwed up, it's a kind of a different. We got 5 houses, not 105, right? That's just my thought.
And there's really only the house number 5 has never been affected. He's about 3 to 4 feet higher than anybody else along there.
And I'll show all that here in just one minute.
Just what the last piece that might be important is when we have ice floods,
Ice jam flooding.
are they always there, or do we spread them through the whole system?
No, it usually backs up right there. We'll show you after on the big map there.
Sure.
And where the narrows are, and the islands start, and that's where the ice seems to pile up. The last jam there in 2021 happened within 10 minutes from when the ice started to move till there was water around the people's houses.
And actually, if we go to the next slide, I'll show you exactly that. So this photograph was taken downstream view, and you can see how the ice accumulated on the left bank and the right bank. And I've got that outlined in the red dotted lines. So you can see there's quite a funnel there that doesn't allow for the passage of ice. So that ice jam occurred around about January the 12th, and it was mainly caused from river ice breaking up upstream and floating downstream and jamming up. And shortly after this photo was taken, the ice jam actually breached and water levels then receded. Only to have a second ice jam form about 2 weeks later around January 25th. And Ian certainly knows a lot about that one. And that ice jam formed because of colder temperatures, which formed frazzle ice, which end up jamming down into that funnel and flooding the properties for a second time. We go to the next slide.
And that word frazzle ice is really important because there's a difference between anchor ice and frazzle ice. And
Yes.
Frazzle ice historically is what gets us.
Yes, frazzle ice starts as little crystals in the water, and as it super cools, it starts building up into larger pans and it starts floating. And then you've got these pancake-looking pans that flow down the river. Sometimes you'll see them with a white ring around them. That's because they're bumping into each other. And then, of course, those pans will stick to bridge piers, corners on rivers, narrow channels. They're gravel bars. And these are typical areas where ice jams will typically form. And so this is a view, an overall view of the subdivision, properties 1 to 5. And you can see properties 1, 2, and 3, the homes were surrounded by floodwater. Home number 4 was impacted from the front side, from the river. And then as you can see, home number 5, being on a little higher ground, was free and clear. And so this gives you a pretty good idea of the space that the river needs to accommodate flood flows. And this is something that I just cannot overemphasize. Keep in mind, the flow was estimated at 118 cubic meters per second. 1 year later, slide, I flew the area on a Casera training flight, and Dave knows about Casera training flights. I took photographs of the subdivision again, which would have been last January. And the estimated flow, as you can see, was 59 cubic meters per second, and there's no flood threat. Today, the estimated flow is about 53 cubic meters per second, so the river is pretty low. And so if history means anything, we shouldn't see any ice jam flooding. That makes sense? So that kind of takes care of the historical part of things. And I'd just like to talk a bit more in depth about managing the Nechako floodplain. Next slide. So here is a cross-section of a typical floodplain. And of course, the widths of these floodplains can vary depending on where you are. And there's 2 components to the floodplain. One is the flood fringe, where it's accepted practice to build. And then there's a floodway. And the one thing I want to emphasize here, that any building and any floodway anywhere, it diminishes, excuse me, the river's natural flood storage capacity, and it reduces the river's ability to accommodate larger flood flows. And this is when it's so important not to build in the floodway. In the floodway, the minimum floodway is 30 meters on each side of the river, and that distance can be increased depending on the topography, on how low that floodplain is. BC's floodproofing standard is to construct buildings above the 200-year flood level plus the freeboard. And that gives us what is called the flood construction level. And that freeboard is added on to take into account any hydrologic uncertainties in the calculations. And so if you want to build a house in the flood fringe, all habitable space must be built above the FCL. If you want a basement, the basement is habitable space which should be built above ground, above the FCL. That's the standard in BC. Next slide. Local governments do have regulatory tools such as the floodplain management bylaw. And in that bylaw, setbacks are specified, as well as the flood construction level that we've been talking about. And the minimum setback right now for the Nechako is 30 meters from the natural boundary. Incidentally, the regional district uses a 45-meter setback from the natural boundary, just so you know. And so these are tools that are used to help regulate development. Next slide. And in that floodplain bylaw is the floodplain mapping. And this shows the eastern half of Vanderhoof. In the next slide, shows the western half of Vanderhoof. It's a little bit hard to see the 200-year floodplain limit, but we'll see that on another map shortly. Next slide. Another regulatory tool, which is the official community plan, or the OCP as we call it. In that plan, there are land uses that are described that can be used, and development policies. And so the main policy is to protect against the loss of life and to minimize property damage associated with flood events. And then there's certain kinds of development that can be carried out in the floodplain. And next slide. And part of that regulatory tool is what would look like a zoning map. And these maps should be reviewed regularly and updated, because sometimes things can change depending on the kind of flood events that we might have. So these maps are never static. They should always be changing and improving as we get more data and more flood events occur and so on. Next slide. And so this basically shows the limits of the 200-year flood based on the 200-year flow of 964 cubic meters per second. That's the 200-year flood. And that crosshatched area would potentially become inundated with a flood of that magnitude. We know that the climate is changing. There is very clear evidence of that. The polar ice caps are melting. Our glaciers are melting and receding. And I certainly saw that in the 35 years that I did snow surveys in the Rocky Mountains. I saw glaciers receding like crazy. And so that's really affecting the water cycle. And so with that extra moisture in the air and the warmer temperatures, we're seeing a very significant climate change. And that goes to our next slide. And climate change is happening. The climate's always changing, let's face it, but it's changing at a fairly rapid rate. And so we're going to see the increasing likelihood of extreme heat events, heavy rain events, prolonged dry periods, prolonged wet periods. We saw a prolonged dry period this summer. We were under a drought condition this summer in BC. And the weather seems to be flip-flopping back and forth, where we'll have dry periods and all of a sudden there's a wet period, and we just go back and forth. And of course, this all results in landslides, slope stability issues, flooding, which we're talking about today, and drought, and of course, wildfires. Sometimes there's loss of life. There's usually loss of infrastructure and other resources. And the wildlife and aquatic habitat are most definitely affected. I'm sure Wayne has lots of experience in that area. Slide.
Interesting that we've actually had floods, drought, and pestilence all in the same summer.
Exactly, and that's that flip-flopping effect of the weather as a result of the changing climate. So for our purposes today, we're talking about floods. And so we can expect to see very rapid snow melts more often. And when we have a high snowpack, that could be very problematic. Rain on snow events, convective storms with extreme heat. And then we'll also see widespread high intensity rainfall events. We've already seen that in BC already. And of course, this is all brought upon by these cold lows and troughs and ridges that just pass through our part of the province very, very quickly. Slide. And so that's why I go back to the floodway. Given that the climate's changing, it's more important than ever that these floodways be kept free of development as much as possible. It's so important. And here we see the floodway area upstream of the Burrard Bridge. We've already looked at the north and south shores. And so there's a floodway area here and even further upstream. These are areas that are needed by the river to accommodate those larger flood flows. And I expect that we're going to see even more flood events in the future. Next slide. I like this photo for a couple of reasons. But first of all, you see the volunteers are all standing on the HESCO baskets, and I'll show you what they look like in more detail a bit later. But sandbag buttresses were placed on the land side because there was concern the HESCO baskets might topple over due to the soft ground. So the water levels high could push over the HESCO baskets. So these sandbag buttresses were built. And despite the fact that there's a flood protection resource being deployed here, there was still flooding on the land side, which clearly shows the porous nature of the soils and the space that the river needs. One thing I like about this photo is all the volunteers that you see, and it certainly shows the community spirit that there is here in Vanderhoof when we had a flood emergency and everybody got together and worked together and really helped out. So this is one of my favorite photos, actually. Next slide. Now, I talked a little bit about the floodway, and this can be a sensitive subject, but there are communities that are taking floodplain management one step further. And that is reclaiming the floodway. And an example of that is in Prince George, actually. On the left-hand photo, you can see a large sawmill burner. And just behind it, you can just barely see a very large gray-colored tank, and there were other structures there. And they were removed after the 2007 flood. River Road was raised up to about a meter, and it acts as a setback dike. So essentially, this floodway area has been reclaimed, giving the river the space that it needs to accommodate flood flows. Next slide. Just looking down River Road a little further, properties were bought out, houses were removed. And so now that floodway space has been reclaimed. There's no more emergency response cost, no more recovery cost, and no more human suffering. So floodway reclamation is something to think about. And if there are residents that, there are a few residents that do live in the floodway and they don't wish to move, but there are other options too, you know, floodproofing your own home, and there is the option of a community dike and so on. So there are options. But in my opinion, the best solution is floodway reclamation. That gives the river the space that it needs. It's just that simple. Next slide. So what kind of land uses could be carried out in the floodway? Well, agricultural lands, pasture land, nature reserves, wildlife sanctuaries, recreation, parks. And in communities, parks can be a real asset to a community when they're located along the rivers. And we've seen that in Prince George and other communities. You go to the next slide. An example of that is in Prince George, the Cottonwood Island Park. It's in the floodway. If it floods, no big deal. When the floodwaters recede, you just simply clean off a little bit of that wood debris and the park's ready to use again. So parks along the river corridors can be a real attractive benefit to the community, and people love their parks. It's a place where you can go walking, take nature hikes, ride your bike, walk your dog, you know, and it promotes a healthy community. And so parks are an ideal use for those floodway lands, especially in the community. It's just something to think about. Well, Vanderhoof has certainly used sandbags and berms and HESCO baskets, especially back in 2007. And those HESCO baskets are basically baskets that are folded up on pallets. You unfold them, set them up, fill them up with sand or gravel, and they become an instant flood barrier. And tiger dams are also used. They're basically water-filled tubes that can be used for emergency flood protection as well. Next slide. And so the HESCO baskets, the tiger dams, and sandbags, they're all supplied by EMBC. They're stored in Chilliwack. I've had a few chats with EMBC about storing these resources up in our part of the province, because as we saw this year, the highway disappeared.
Missing,
right?
yes.
So hopefully maybe there's some lessons learned from this past flood event. And so I've had opportunity to work part-time for EMBC and try to promote our area as a center, or as one of the centers for these resources. And Prince George, through EMBC, have 2 sandbag filling machines. It's stored in Prince George. And then any rock riprap or water pumps or berm material that's usually locally supplied. So those are your basic emergency flood protection resources. Next slide. Another protection resource, which is a little more permanent, and I know a lot of people don't like dikes. However, if you go to a community just west of here, Houston, they've constructed several kilometers of dikes over the years. You can talk to anybody there, and they will tell you how those dikes have protected their community time and time and time again. So dikes are something to consider. Vanderhoof has no dikes. Our community, and I consider this to be my community because I'm out here a lot, we're vulnerable. And so that's something at least to think about.
Does the soil in Houston permeate water through like the soil in Vanderhoof?
Well, as you can see on the dike on the very right photo, that's called the Keekster dike. And you can see there's water actually on the land side of the dike, but there's no development there, fortunately, right? So a better option would have been to have placed the dike maybe a little further over or inland. But at the time, the decision was made to place it there, and that seemed to work. So you have to be very, very careful where you place dikes.
Just your promoting dikes is problematic for me because you can build a dike here and the water will be an equal distance of height on either side if that flood is for greater than 30 days. Pulling that number out of my arse, but
Yeah.
you know, I mean, I had 2 sets of dikes in front of my house and I had as much water behind the house as I had in front of it.
Yeah, and that could be problematic in porous soils, and that's why setback dikes are preferred. So you want those dikes as far back into the flood fringe as possible, so not much water inundates those dikes, right? So dikes have to be very carefully placed. And as you can see on Buck Creek there, the dikes are right along the creek bank, and so there's no space given to the creek to pass flood flows. Fortunately, the creek's fairly small, and the only thing they have to do there is pick logs out of the channel before they get the highway. But all the buildings and everything on both sides of the dikes are protected. So as you can see, the dikes on top in the Bulky River, they are set back to a degree, giving the river that space that it needs. That's really, really important. Slide. Well, landowners can undertake some flood proofing of their own, and we have a landowner here on the left-hand side who's built a plank wall. It's a double plank wall to basically plug off that low spot. On the lower right, the landowner has built a small brick or rock flood wall. Next slide. Where there's existing properties, landowners can sometimes build some nice low-level berms, and you can landscape these berms into your topography so they look pretty reasonable. And when you're standing in your living room or your bedroom, it's not really going to obstruct your view of the river. So it's a choice that landowners can make for themselves to if they want to flood-proof their own properties. Next slide. Some other options, of course, are elevating buildings or building small levees or berms that I talked about, or a combination of walls and landscaping. And in some areas, as you can see on that red brick house, they've built a small concrete flood wall, and you can decorate it with plants and flowers and all kinds of things. So, you can incorporate any flood protection of your home into the landscape, so it looks pretty reasonable. That's an option. Now, there's one landowner in Prince George, you almost got ahead of me there, who took flood proofing to another level. Next slide. Literally. This house, as the houses behind, are right on the Fraser River, and ideally, they're in the floodway and they should all be removed. But this landowner says, no, I'm staying here. So he simply raised up their house, put it on steel stilts, built some decking, and when the floodwaters pass by, they just sit on the deck and simply watch it. This house has been photographed 1,000 times, and this was always the first house to get flooded. But because of what the landowner has done, no more emergency response costs, no recovery costs, and their stress level is way down, right? So this is a bit of an extreme example, but it just goes to show you that, landowners are doing things to protect their homes and properties, as extreme as this might seem.
There's an architect in Holland now that has got a design where the house goes up with the water. It's actually a floating house, and as the water goes up, it goes up, and then the joints all slip up for your sewer, et cetera, et cetera. Very popular apparently. was following him the other month.
Yeah, there's many ways of flood-proofing your own home, and some of them are quite extravagant. Next slide. There's another reason why not to build in the floodway. Land erosion. And there's many different mechanisms of land erosion. One can just simply be the velocity of the water that just simply erodes away the soil. Another is when river levels are high, they can saturate the banks, and banks end up slumping in the river. So you might see a river bank that's been stable for hundreds of years, decades. And all of a sudden, one high water event coupled with a rain event, down it goes. And some of this is caused by, clear cutting all the trees and brush and shrubs off properties. And so this can sort of cause stabilization issues of riverbanks. The three photos you see on the left are a result of the flooding last year around Merritt and Princeton. And I believe some of those houses may have been demolished or some of them moved. I was actually deployed to Kamloops, and my job was to identify all these houses that require demolition or being moved. And there were a lot of houses. It was not a pleasant task, but I've done this before, so I was working for NBC, they called me down, and that's what my task was. And so there are people there that are still suffering the effects of this. That log house that you see on the lower right is on Swift Creek in Valemount. Built too close to the creek, became undermined. Fortunately, the landowners were able to slide that log house off the foundation, and they placed it well back, outside the floodway. Lesson learned. Right? So we've had many instances like this over the years that has caused a lot of disruption in people's lives. I've actually supervised demolition of houses. Not a fun task. Here's a satellite image of the city of Merritt, and this is the catastrophic flood that I wanted to show you. As you can see on the lower right map, they did have dikes, but notice where the dikes are placed, right along the riverbank. The 200-year flood there is about 445 cubic meters per second, but the actual flow was 405. So it wasn't quite a 200-year flood, but a 160-year flood, and it was still a catastrophic event. This is a clear example of the floodway space that rivers need. So I have an aunt and uncle that live near the river, and their basement was filled up with mud, silt, and backed up sewage in November. And then the winter came on just a week or two later. Everything froze up, and they couldn't get at their house. They couldn't clean anything up because they were on evacuation. So it took several months before they could even clean up their basement. And they finally got back into their house this past month. They were out of their house for 11 months. They told me that this was the most devastating time of their lives, and the most stressful time of their lives, being out of their own house for 11 months. So you think of families that were out of their house for weeks and months. They got to do something with their kids. They got to go to school. There's all kinds of things you got to think about, right? So we in Vanderhoof are in a very low-lying floodplain as well. So this is just an example of a catastrophic event that can happen. It could happen here. We've already had several atmospheric rain events hit our northern coast, and we had rain in Kitimat and rain in Prince Rupert. Fortunately, the atmospheric river didn't overtop the coastal mountains and dump precipitation our way. So we've been very fortunate so far. And the catastrophic event that happened here in southern BC was only supposed to occur in the northern part of the United States, but it shifted. And The River Forecast Center and Environment Canada, they were scrambling to come up with forecasts as to what's going to happen next. And they did a pretty good job considering they had very little time to work with. So that's something that we don't want to see happen here. We are very fortunate to live at the latitude that we do. But at some point in time, I'm expecting to see one of those events overtop the coastal mountains. So just something to keep in mind. Next slide. Well, just told you how extremely inconvenient flood events are. We strain our resources because it takes a lot of personnel to respond. Flood events are very time consuming, and we certainly saw that here in Vanderhoof, especially in 2007, 56 days underwater. That's a long flood event, right? And of course, there's always controversy, something that we don't need. But most importantly, people suffer emotional stress, emotional hardships. That's so important. Emergency response costs and recovery costs are also really expensive. So to build safe, sustainable, resilient communities, we need to engage in good floodplain management. Next slide. There are some things to consider. Establishing a flood discharge level for ice jams, and we're currently using a target of 60 cubic meters per second, and that will likely be updated as a consultant works on this. And as Ian well knows, any flood event for floodwaters greater than 550 cubic meters per second is a time to get concerned, and when it gets over 600, there's even more concern yet. I've already talked about diking systems in critical areas, and where there's groundwater, you may have to have some sort of seepage management. That might involve installing an underground perforated pipe with manholes to pump out the groundwater. They have that in Prince George, actually. And so they can keep that groundwater down to a certain level. So that kind of helps out. And then, of course, I talked about landowners, taking it upon themselves to flood-proof their own homes with berms and flood walls and so on. And then I talked a little bit about reclaiming the floodway, which might mean property buyouts. And this would take considerable cooperation on all parties. But if that doesn't happen, like I said, there are other options. Well, flood-proofing your own home and dikes and so on too. So there are other options. Floodplain management bylaws and floodplain mapping need to be reviewed and updated. And I believe Vanderhoof's floodplain mapping is going to be reviewed and updated this coming year. The province authorized funding for that to be administered by the Fraser Basin Council. So I understand that floodplain mapping will be updated sometime this next year. And then, of course, our land use management practices, where we have official community plans and zoning bylaws need to reflect current conditions and even historical conditions. And lastly, we need to develop, if you haven't already, an emergency response plan. So we need to be monitoring the river levels, we need to be monitoring the forecasts, and then develop response actions. And Ian knows all about this, where you increase your response depending on what the river level is. So if the river level is increasing, you increase your response action. Next slide. Well, this is all part and parcel of good planning. I don't need to expand on that anymore. And when we do see a flood event, we need to make sure that we're prepared and have those emergency protection resources. And of course, it takes a coordinated response between local government, provincial and federal governments. And when all of these things line up, we'll have a successful emergency operation, and we can have a very successful recovery. And so with that, I just want to leave you with the 4 pillars of emergency management. And that's mitigation, preparation, response, and recovery. Next slide. I encourage us to put lots of effort into mitigation, into the planning side of things, to make sure that we have all of the resources in place. So we don't have to, next slide. So we don't have to put much response into response and recovery. It's just that simple. And so next slide. My rocks are underwater. It's time for me to quit. And I thank you all for listening. And at this time, I think we can have maybe a few minutes for questions or any comments that you might have, and then we can move on to the next presentation. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very informative. Earlier, you mentioned about bank erosion and how that can, some of the things that can cause that. I would be curious about if you have any ideas for solutions for that. As someone who we live thankfully further back from the river, but just, and ours was not from us cutting down trees, but with battling a beaver, and he's been taking it out. But this summer, we really noticed, because it was so warm, we did a lot of floating down the river this summer, and we just saw in a lot of areas that there was some significant erosion, especially just this past year. And I think because of the, like you're saying, that flip-flopping in the weather. And I'm just wondering what individuals and then also us as a community can do to, I know there's studies and things being done, but are there any things even that we can do on our property that would help with that mitigation of bank erosion?
There's all kinds of things you can do, like we call it bioengineering. So you can plant stakes and that can grow vegetation and stuff like that. So there's all kinds of information on the internet regarding bioengineering.
Bioengineering is what
There's other names for it too. I just can't think of all the names. But people will replant trees, brush, and that kind of vegetation that works well to give the bank more stability, that kind of stuff. So I call that a soft engineering kind of thing. It's a bioengineering, soft engineering, which can work pretty good. So you can grow trees and brush and shrubs that grow well in the area and put them along the bank. And there's other ways too. There's geofabric type mats that you can use. Hang over banks and stake them down and grow shrubs and that sort of thing in those geomats and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different ways that you can bioengineer riverbanks to help stabilize it. And there may be people here who may even have more ideas.
Touch on that way?
Yeah, we do a lot. If you go to our news site, Nechako Environment, Water, Stewardships, you'll see some stuff we've done in the Nechako. I was just going to show you. It's massive, it's expensive, it looks ugly to begin with, but it's beautiful afterwards because it grows up. So you're just allowing the water to go across the bank aspect of it. Eh? So it's not this, it's this.
Okay.
But we do lots of it, and it's very effective. But we're trying to do some stuff here on Riverside Park rather than kind of harden it off. But we did an experiment in there. We went in and planted a bunch of.
Yeah, we have a view of that. So we saw those snow fence.
You see the success. We're running 87% survival. Our key for survival will be next spring if it, that's because they're fragile in the winter. So
And with all the in and out of the swimmers, this was the busiest summer we've ever seen for kids running up and down the bank. It did very well to stay. So
Absolutely.
that's a good, solid.
So,
To it.
And again, for us, the issue that we identified was easier. 60 years ago, where was the river bank?
Right.
It is here today. And where will it be in 50 years? And it's actually across the sidewalk and it takes out a couple lamp posts and a couple of those benches and everything. So that's the soft engineering.
Right.
Do something with your riparian zone. Because we're on the right beside the sturgeon bed, because we have sturgeon with Sarah listed issues, we're kind of handicapped. If it was your or my land, we'd fix that real quick. We'd just pull it back, slope it, plant it up really hard, do what we did here, pin it, et cetera. And Bob's your uncle would be finished in a couple of weeks. But we're screwed. And we've been on this project, I know, Kevin, three years now. But we've had a $3.5 million proposal. I think a $2.5 million proposal. Now we got a 10-cent one. And it's actually that one's going to work. At the end of the day.
Yeah.
But it's not quite as attractive. Right. It's what it is. If I could make a couple of comments, Kevin, and I think council in particular, there's so much responsibility for us as councils to make sure that we don't make the wrong mistakes. I owned a house on 3rd Avenue, so right behind what was Pat's Esso for all the old timers in the community. box behind Pat Cecil. When I bought it, an elderly gentleman came over with a bottle of raspberry wine and a picture, and he said, "Here, this is what your house looked like in 1908." And it was a barn, and the water was halfway up the distance. So right below 4th Avenue, if you stare as you start to climb up 4th Avenue on the south side, you'll see an old trapper's cabin that's disintegrated. He showed me another picture of a canoe parked there. And I bought this house, I was a kid. I paid a horrible amount of money. All 10,000 of the dollars, because it was more money than I had ever seen before. But then he showed me this picture of my house, and it was halfway underwater. And that's along the Jesus Way from where we're sitting right now.
Yeah.
So in 1908, we did this before, right?
Yeah.
That's how we ended up here.
If you go back into those times when I've seen pictures where that side of the tracks used to flood 3 times a year.
Yeah.
And the Reed Hotel where it sits now is its second home. It used to sit in the area where KFC is. And they actually moved it across the tracks because it didn't flood as much
It was safer on this side.
on this side. And there used to be 3 bridges in Vanderhoof too. A lot of people don't understand that. You know, coming across Riverside Park, there was 3 separate channels that came through and in behind where the sturgeon hatchery is and all that. So the water did have different means of getting through and stuff back then. But yeah, that side of town, you know, used to come in behind the museums and that and feed off of Stony Creek area and come right through and then go back through and then go out where McDonald's is built now and then back across the main road and out. And a lot of people don't understand Loop Road either, just to the north of Murray Creek, where the big spruce trees are there. That used to flood every year. And the road used to go up, they used to go up Murray Creek Road across and then up the bank to the old mill site years ago as well.
So if you look at, if you carry on from that story, the Reed Drive that is there was the old highway to Fort St. James. And so they crossed where the community gardens, the community garden is there by wagon. They actually crossed the river, went on to Reed Drive. They jumped up and rather exit where we exit today, if you look between Manwaring's house, that used to be it. And then it goes down to Murray Creek, up where Tommy Silvers lives, and Grandma Lieberler.
Yeah.
Now we're all old. The trail is behind Tommy's house, and that went to Fort St. James, right?
Oh, wow.
And so
You can still see that.
what our good fire chief was just telling us about not flooding, or how we were flooded behind there. Apparently when they constructed Pine Street, which is beside the museum site, that actually blocked the water off for a period of time. That became a dike aspect of it. And then the last part of my story is when they built the dam, of course, the river was shut off completely, and that became a gravel pit. And so they took all of the gravels out that whole length from the bird sanctuary all the way down to the corner where the community garden is. And that was all excavated out of there and put on wagons and hauled up and used to fill the community. And that's why this side of the tracks didn't flood it after that, is because they used the gravel pit.
A lot of interesting history. I'd like to know more, actually.
Could I just and I don't want to bore, but just one other point that intrigued me and interested me. The Frazzle ice at 60 cubic meters is an important part of the conversation. So you can see, Al's math said if you keep it at 40, that we're actually in pretty good shape. I personally am campaigning for 60 because we believe that if we're not going to serolist salmon, and that is a conversation that is out there, we actually need more water above our reds, above the spawning beds. We think 40 is problematic, and we're urging to test that theory out. But we think that there's anchor ice that's going right down to the reds and suffocating them. And if we had 60,
We're promoting 60, actually.
yeah, but 60 is problematic for Frazzle ice.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. The one thing that can work hand in hand is if the community becomes more resilient in terms of diking and flood-proofing the community, making the people safe, and actually discharge more water, which will enhance the fisheries value. So it's a win-win, really, when you think about it. So all of these things work hand in hand on the river. Whatever you do on the river, there's always a domino effect. And so like Wayne's talking about, the fish need more water, and humans want less water, right? So we have this competing interest. And so that's where it's really important that all parties come together and we work together, the fisheries people, the flood hazard people, the community people, council, everybody sitting at the table, and then we can come up with a nice balanced plan. And it's going to take some dollars, but there's always provincial funding available for dikes that can be applied for, stuff like that. And to have a dike in the community, of course, would probably take a referendum or a vote and that sort of thing. So you'd have to go through the process. And if it all works out and you protect the community and you can enhance the fisheries value at the same time, everybody wins. Pretty simple.
I think there's another method. I'm so against your idea of diking my side of the river because we'll all fight you in court. So
well, that's fine.
I think there is another method, and the next gentleman doing his presentation should be covering that we can manage that reservoir in a different sort of way. There is options.
Yeah, there are options, but you have to understand there's not only reservoir management, there's also land management. And those have to work hand in hand. And I've been in this flood business for 40 years. I've seen too much flooding, too much damage, too many emergency dollars spent, and I've seen too much human suffering. Been there, I've seen it.
We've also seen the province of British Columbia has over-harvested and didn't care a shit about anything you just said.
Well, yeah. Right. Well, there's problems in every avenue of life. Okay. But,
Yeah.
When it comes to the fisheries, fish don't have any choice. They take what they get. We as humans, we can make choices. So if we work together, we can make good choices. And we're not always going to be agreeable on things. That's okay. But you can have reservoir management, you can have land management, you can all work together, and we can come up with a nice balanced plan that can satisfy the fisheries value, the human value, and the environmental value.
Do we have the geography for a diking system?
Dikes in Vanderhoof, some parts of the river could be a bit challenging because there's a couple of stretches where homes are fairly close to the river. So that could be challenging, but it can happen, provided everybody is agreeable to it, right? And if dikes are not an option in some places, well, then landowners can, flood-proof their own homes, and we can do a much better job in land management. Stop building in the floodway to start with, right? And manage our lands. This is a problem throughout the whole of BC. It's not just here. So every community has these issues.
Just quickly share something, and I won't take up too much time here, but I recently just moved back to Vanderhoof from Merritt. So I lived in Merritt for the past 2 years. I was a firefighter first responder throughout the flooding. I was on the recovery team throughout the flooding. And having seen firsthand the devastation that is caused, anything that this community can do to prevent that is well worth it. There are still 900 people without homes in Merritt, likely will never get to return. I might get emotional just because it was quite a thing, but something like this today is so important, and for everyone to rally together and do what they can to protect the community, because once something like that happens, it's never the same.
It changes lives forever, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Okay, we need to move on, and our next presenter is Rio Tinto, and I thank you all for your contribution. This is a very interesting conversation, actually. And so Rio Tinto, welcome, and I believe there's Andrew and Aman, and I'm not quite sure who's going to present here, but Aman, we'll just give it over to you. And
Andrew was right there, and there you go.
Okay.
Behind us.
I'm always behind you guys watching. Excellent. So look, my sincere apologies for not being there in the flesh. I think I've been avoiding a cold for the last few days, and then it finally caught up to me on Thursday and Friday. So I've spent yesterday running hot and cold, feeling marginally better today, but certainly felt it best not to be with a large group of people in Vanderhoof today. Okay, can I just confirm my camera is working? Because it's looking weird on my side. Yep, perfect.
We can see you.
Okay, I'll share my screen and we should be in business. So look, really appreciate Lyle and his comments sort of leading up, and it's probably a nice segue to sort of shifting gears to the reservoir and how hydropower systems across the province and you know really across the world sort of look at flow and flow-based decision making. And I'll tailor that sort of specifically to the Nechako reservoir and the tools and the systems that we use there. But also worth reflecting that the tools and the systems we used are very closely aligned to the way BC Hydro manages their water systems, the way Quebec Hydro manages theirs, and another number of other public utilities and hydro facility operators. Okay, let's see if I can get my slides working. There we are. So look, I'll start high level. I'd just like to reflect on this with community members sort of regularly, because even myself, I tend to lose sight of sort of that broader picture of what we're actually talking about. So the region that we're talking, obviously here in the Nechako, but interestingly, as it pertains to Vanderhoof, Prince George, and other downstream flood impacts, we also need to consider the other watersheds here as well. So not only is it the Nechako Reservoir, it's the Notley River watershed, the Nechako River lower watershed, and then the Stewart River also is a contributor to the rivers in and around that area. So roughly, it's an area around the size of 50,000 square kilometers, or around the same size as Switzerland. So again, just we always need to keep in mind that the area that we're talking about is an enormous piece of the province and ultimately an enormous piece of Canada. But also as well, it is quite a significant area for variable weather conditions across. You know, certainly what we're seeing here in the Coast Mountain Range can be quite different to what we see in some of these lower lying areas, and certainly can be very different to what we see in the upper Stewart River, which is more akin to what they see in the Peace River watersheds as well. So again, just worth reflecting on that as well. Right, I am going to pause because I've just realized that I have been a little bit remiss in not introducing myself. I've come to sort of get a little bit complacent in Vanderhoof, given I know just about everyone there. But for those who don't know me, I am Andrew Zornahallen. I'm the Operations Director for Energy and Watershed Partnerships, so looking after Rio Tinto's operations here in British Columbia as it pertains to energy generation, the relationships with Kamano and the transmission system, and then ultimately the Nechako Reservoir and the associated hydrology and associated dam and dam safety infrastructure that's out there. Right, apologies for that. Okay, I'm going to touch sort of high level on some of the things, and I know Lyle sort of touched on some of these already. Competing priorities, competing objectives, and then basically our hierarchy for reservoir and dam management. So number one for us, and we make no bones about this, is dam safety and dam integrity. Kenny Dam and Skins Lake Spillway 1 and 2 are some of the highest consequence dams in Canada, and even some of the highest consequence dams in the world if they were to suffer a catastrophic failure. So what we're talking about there is a dam breach or a dam break. So that's where, you know, that dam failures can happen for a variety of different reasons. If that were to happen, the impacts would be catastrophic. I'm not going to talk about that mechanism of flooding today, but it is worth noting that there is a full-scale dam emergency plan that is available in the District of Vanderhoof Fire Hall. It's in the library. It's online as well. You can find it. And that covers the inundation mapping for Vanderhoof and as well all of the communities along the Nechako River watershed, the Fraser River watershed, all the way through to Vancouver. And the Fraser River Delta obviously discharges around Vancouver Airport there. So if the most catastrophic failure were ever to happen, the impacts would be felt as far south as that. But again, today I'm just going to sort of gear the conversation to regular high water events and how we manage. But certainly over and above everything, dam safety is our #1 focus. Okay, number 2, fisheries conservation. There are a number of fisheries drivers that are firstly part of our water license and the agreements under which Rio Tinto operates the watershed in line with the Industrial Development Act. And then on top of that, there are a series of prescribed guidelines as well. So we have hard licensed minimum flows. We have a fixed temperature target in summer, which is targeted at a point where the Stewart River actually conjoins or the Stewart River confluence, where it's a fisheries target such that the river is not to exceed 20 degrees Celsius at that most sensitive spawning time. And at the moment, that's a calendar-driven entity from the 15th of July to the 20th of August. So those two things are mandated as part of our license. And then more recently, we've been integrating guidelines and guidances for how to achieve the most ecological value from any releases that are happening. So that's around replicating spring freshets, minimizing the amount of pre-freshet releases and trying to provide for some of those higher winter flows if there is that water availability in the reservoir. So certainly fisheries conservation is a huge element. And regardless of what's happening with regards to energy and energy generation, those fisheries targets are still fixed. The next one, flood control. And we always talk about this in terms of probabilities, and we always talk about this in terms of likelihoods. And I'll get into much more detail about what that looks like and really dealing with the uncertainties of hydrology, dealing with the uncertainties of weather, and as Lyle's touched on, dealing with the uncertainties of what seems to be changing weather patterns at the moment. And I'll cover off on that a little bit more. Lastly, we need to manage generation in Kumano. So the Nechako Reservoir, it's not an endless supply of water. It is certainly limited, and water ultimately is what limits the volume of energy that can be provided from the Kumano powerhouse. And that goes to two priorities. First one is to the smelter, and we need to manage the hydrology in the reservoir to ensure that we always have enough water available for the smelter, so that we don't run short by the time we get to the end of winter and before the next spring has started. And then the other part of that is providing energy to BC Hydro. We are the largest independent power producer in BC. We are completely integrated with BC's provincial energy balance and provincial energy grid, and we provide a critical service, powering roughly, as we sit here today, it's actually close to 400,000 British Columbian residents. So quite proud to say that the lights are staying on there in Vanderhoof are being powered from the electrons being generated out of Kumano at the moment. Okay. So how do we do all of that? The first thing that underpins everything we do is a complex hydrometeorological network. So we accumulate data and data points from, firstly, all of the publicly available Environment Canada. There's a number of government-owned meteorological networks and stations across the whole of North America. And we also go all the way down through to the Pacific, given the energy patterns and the the weather patterns and weather systems that come up through the Pacific having a huge impact on us. We also own and operate our own hydrometeorological network. We have snow pillow stations across the watershed. So we have here at Tatsa, we have snow pillow and standard weather station. Pondozi, we have snow pillow as well. And then at Mount Wells, there are snow pillows. In addition, Environment Canada owns and operates snow pillows here at Lou Lake, which serves as a reasonable proxy for the Francois Lake, Fraser Lake systems and how that flows in as well. We then also collect manual snowpack data. So once and sometimes even twice a month, we'll fly a helicopter circuit around a number of these areas, and we'll continue collecting weather data, snowpack data, temperature data, etc. And then even sometimes we will do surveys into the soil to understand the level of saturation that the soil has so that we can continue collecting all of that data. Basically, what we do with all of that data, and we receive, it's roughly 18,000 data points every 15 minutes flow into our supercomputer that basically manages the hydrological model that supports the Nechako reservoir. But basically what we do is we take all of this area and we divide it into 5 kilometer squares. And then those 5 kilometer squares, they get a series of attributes defined for them. So are they treed? Are they facing north or south? What's their elevation? Have they had a wildfire over them in recent years? And all of that provides for, so each of those squares then have applied to it real-time data from a snow station. So from that, we can build up a picture, not only what's happening at these exact points, but also what's happening across. It builds basically a hydrological profile of that whole area. So it's a big complex piece of work. I'll introduce you to the hydrological team sort of a little bit later. But there's a team of people that host this. It's software that has been developed in-house and has actually been shared with BC Hydro and a number of other proprietary users. And we often joke that the hydrologists working on the Nechako have been doing big data since before big data was a fashionable buzzword. Okay, so what do we deal with? The water management challenge. We're always looking to define what the best spillway releases are, and then Kamano generation decisions are, considering all of the uncertainties that we face. The uncertainties that we look at, snowpack, we never know on any given year, are we going to have an extraordinarily high snowpack or an extraordinary low snowpack? And again, if we had the benefit of looking forward and we knew, for instance, that this year we were going to face 200% of long-term average snow, we would take decisions that would continue spilling at higher than minimum levels across winter. Notionally, what we do to combat that is we always revert to a median, and I'll show that sort of a little bit later on. We deal with the uncertainties of precipitation, and precipitation can be rain, it can be snow, it can be sleet, and we deal with the distribution of that and the quantity between weather stations. Given we have extreme mountains, in particular on the west side of the watershed, we can have extreme localized rain events or snow events that aren't necessarily representative of, that sort of part of the watershed. So we always need to be mindful of that as well. Inflows are a tough science to predict. And basically what inflows are is the volume of water that's liberated from snow or that falls as rain and that ultimately makes it from the land on which it's falling into the river. Into the reservoir. And that can be influenced by temperature, it can be influenced by rain, it can be influenced by whether the ground was saturated before freeze up or whether it was dry before freeze up. And certainly this is actually a concern for us this year because the land was incredibly dry when we went into a freeze-up situation. So there's concerns that the level of inflow to the reservoir when we get to next spring could be considerably less than typical because of that dry land and ultimately that water balance in the land being made up. And then lastly, weather forecasts. And weather forecasts are always interesting. Typically, we get very accurate and reliable forecasts at 5 days. 7 days can be, relied upon as well. And then we start to see little better than chance when you move past that 7-day sort of horizon. And certainly seasonal forecasts as well tend to be very challenged. And, the data that we have shows that for the Nechako watershed, they tend to be little better than chance. So that's the uncertainties. So how do we deal with all of that? Basically, what we do is we go through an analysis of any given day of our initial state. What do we know today? Today, we know snowpack, we know what the inflows are currently doing, and we can take an assessment at soil moisture. We then overlay that, the current weather forecast, precipitation and temperature, and even wind factors into this a little bit, but mostly precipitation and temperature. We then look at the past, which seems a little bit counterintuitive, but the way we predict the future is by looking at the past. And we plot all of the 65 years of history that we have available to us from a precipitation and temperature perspective to the current conditions to say, well, what could it look like moving forward? So that will plot, the driest years, that will plot the wettest years and a range all the way through. And then what we can do is we can start to see where the cluster is and take decisions based on that. And I'll cover that more in a minute. And then what that means for us is we can then predict an ensemble stream flow. And so it takes all of those elements together and we can predict what's going into the reservoir, and that can then predict what we need to flow out of the reservoir. Okay, I'll show one more slide and then I'll pause for questions because I'm covering a lot of ground. So what does that look like in reality? So the way this looks on any given day, we've got actual data that you see here. We've observed it or we've calculated it, and you can see those discharges, or you can see what's been observed coming in. We then have the present day. We then apply that 4-day weather forecast, and then we plot what we call spaghetti charts. And these are the 60 years of historical weather. So you can actually call out any one of these curves and say, hey, look, this one here, that was, 2007, for example. This one here, that may have been 2015, for example. And then when we rank those curves, that's when we can start to take a determination as to what's going to happen in the future. And on the whole, it's quite an accurate way to predict, but it does have limitations. And when it really becomes limited is when we start to have unprecedented weather events. And that's where the model can become a little irrational. And that's where we're looking to really understand and better sanitize that as we move forward to the future. All right, I'm going to pause there. I'm going to grab a quick glass of water. But any comments, questions, feedback on what we've seen so far? Excellent. I hope everybody's still awake. What happens when I can't read the room? Okay, so reservoir management, I'm not going to go through all of these elements, but basically what this looks like is we have our static inputs. We have things that are fixed in time. We know how much water the reservoir can store. We know the flood thresholds at Vanderhoof, Cheslada Lake, and we know how much energy Kamano can produce. Those things are fixed. These are in the model. They're built in. They're completely understood. And they basically, they largely remain unchanged over time. Then we have our dynamic inputs. So smelter load changes, Kamano outage schedules. So as my team does maintenance in Kamano, for example, as BC Hydro do transmission line maintenances in the region and in the north, all of those things get factored in. We have the minimum and maximum spillway discharges. So we know, again, how much we can spill. We know what the minimum is from a fisheries constraint. We know what the maximum is based on those flooding outputs. We factor in the various energy export products. So tier 2 energy is energy that BC Hydro receives and then continues to distribute and reticulate across the province. Tier 1 energy is a premium energy product for BC Hydro, and that is critical to their ability to supply and meet the demand in the most load-intensive parts of the year. So typically that's winter, and BC Hydro can schedule that and call upon that energy anytime they have a critical need. Other times they've done this in the past is when there's been transmission line maintenances or overhauls between Prince George and Telkwa. And then, we've been called upon to produce energy exclusively for the north. So, there's been times where Kamano is the only provider of energy for, Kitimat, Terrace, Smithers, Prince Rupert, and anything beyond that. So those times of the year, I'm certainly always sleeping with one eye open. I'm not a fan of those times of the year. We always start with the reservoir levels, and then ultimately we start to build up our predictions and our forecasts on that. All of that's fed into a series of complicated algorithms. And what that does is it provides us a series of probabilities for Kamano generation, spillway discharge, total flow at Vanderhoof, energy export tier 1 and tier 2, and then ultimately reservoir level. These are what we call a decision-making tool. Over that sits myself, who's been in the area for 5, 6, actually over 6 years now. We have our hydrologists who've been a part of this, and we all review this and say, is this the best possible outcome for what we're trying to achieve, and for all of the combined interests that we're balancing? And then typically when we're at times of tough decisions to be taken, we'll then take those back to First Nations communities, and we'll take those back to the community leaders meetings to test our thinking and see if there's any concerns that we haven't come up with. So, there are meetings where we have the District of Vanderhoof, we have the regional district, we have Lyle Larson joins, we have the River Forecast Centre, sometimes the Water Comptroller, Province of BC, and then at times of high water, we've even had Emergency Management BC on those calls. So all of that comes together, and all of that is basically that summation of how we take these decisions for flows in the Nechako River. This is what the outputs look like. So we can produce a number of hundreds of charts. These are some of the ones that I go to inform our decision making quite significantly. So these are examples. These are ones that we've pulled. So this was the 27th of October, 2022. This is what you can see on here. We plot the actual level in the reservoir. Plots all the way through. There we are, and we get to actual day. We plot the 4 days of weather in front of it, and then we plot all of the 65 years of data below it. And so the way to read this is the wettest sequence on record is this light dotted blue line at the top. And you can see that it was quite an irrational year, that light dotted blue line. No, I'm not going to hazard a guess on which that was, but I'll come to that in a little bit later. The minimum, the driest sequence on record is this red one down the bottom. And then we have the 80 to 20 percentile range, and that's this shaded blue area. So that's where you can actually see that there is a pretty decent concentration and a fairly accurate forecast for where we are going to finish the end of the water year, or sorry, the end of the winter, before we move back into that spring freshet period and the reservoir starts to fill. So when you look at, flooding, if the drivers are flooding, you're always looking to balance and have that full reservoir sort of mitigated, and you ultimately want to sort of stick within this 90 to 95 percentile range. If you're looking at the interest of, making sure that we protect the smelter, we always need to make sure that we don't get to these sort of, 5, 10, 15% of long-term average, reservoir full before we get to that next spring freshet and the system can recharge. So you can see the variability. 9 times out of 10, we'll follow this curve quite well and we'll be within this nice sort of blue shaded area. But every now and then we get these oddball years. We'll get this strange high up here or this strange low down here. And that's really what represents the challenge for flow decision making, because we always need to keep in mind that those things can happen. Okay. That puts out a spillway release forecast. So again, this is looking forward to 2023. It's actual data, but it is a good example. And you can see that the model is basically holding a flow slightly above the NFCP minimum flow for the majority of the winter. So we keep it across, And then what it could look like when we get to the spring is potentially, the 50 percentile. It basically has sort of minimum flows across the spring period, and then it comes into the summer temperature program. What's this one here? The average is this one here, where we have a slight increase in the spring. So notionally, we could reasonably expect that. There's a 10% chance that we will have a significantly high snowpack, and come the spring, we will need to release a significant amount of water. And that's this red curve here. I will just caution, these are model outputs. We wouldn't actually define a release curve that looks like this. The reality is, if we were to sort of have that situation where we needed to release, so these red curves, the reality is we'd probably do something more like this. So we would flatten that curve and sort of eliminate those large scale fluctuations and variations. And then the last one is, there's a very small chance that, potentially we could have an unprecedented weather event, and you have one of these incredibly wet springs, which would notionally lead to flood impacts in the Cheslada system as it moves through that upper part of the Nechako. So this is what we're always facing. We run these charts multiple times a week. I do a report out each week, and then we meet and we share these with the community leaders, typically every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on what's happening. But those meeting frequencies can increase as we approach the high water situations, etc. This is what it looks like translated for Vanderhoof. So this is a reflection of what it could look like next year. Again, you see roughly 50 cubic meters per second for the majority of the winter, building off of Ian before, sort of that, should keep a relatively low ice jam risk. And then you can see that in the majority of the scenarios, we should see a little increase to around, somewhere between 220 through to sort of 100 cubic meters per second in the spring, and then up to here. Again, I will caution though, we currently don't have a good read on what the snowpack is. So this is basically just plotting the historical averages on the current actual. If we see the snowpack increase over winter, you certainly will be able to see these curves increase, and you could see it take a dramatic shift at some point in time. So, and it's not unreasonable to be anywhere between the red and the blue dotted lines. It's also not impossible to be outside of the red or the blue. So again, all of that needs to be factored in decision making.
May I ask a question?
Certainly.
So I was just seeing that baseline of that you're using a 50. So just out of curiosity, I don't know if you have information about like what it was just, and then Nechako just before kind of it froze. Like some water was let out, but it was really low this fall, like the lowest that we remember seeing it. But I just to give an idea of what that looks like for a layperson, what it might have been running at.
Absolutely. So look, it was actually quite an interesting fall this year. So we actually had the driest summer and fall on record by the time we reached freeze up this year. And actually what I'll do is I'll flick over to my magic cheat sheet. And what was interesting about that is we were actually releasing, if you go to Skins Lake Spillway releases, we were releasing right on 60 cubic meters per second, which is nearly double sort of the minimum or the typical Skins Lake Spillway discharge at that time of year, which is 32. So whilst double was being released, what you actually saw in the Nechako was, and if I look at typical Vanderhoof flow, you actually saw flows slightly slightly below the average. And where that was coming from is the contribution from the Notley River and the other low-lying watersheds was at historic low levels. Certainly in my time, I've never seen levels that low. And when I look back at the data, there has not been another year where we've seen those low-lying. So right before freeze up, as we sort of look, I think it was around early November, we started to see freeze up. Actual flows at Skins Lake Spillway were, at Vanderhoof were about 66 cubic meters per second. And recognizing that we're actually releasing 60 at Skins Lake Spillway at that time. So, and just for everybody's information, this is a publicly accessible website. Anybody can jump onto this website. It's called Nechako Flow Facts. If you punch that into Google, it'll be the first link that comes up. And what you can actually do is then select any year in history to see what it looked like in other years as well. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and like I said, this year was an extremely unusual one. Yeah, as you can see, the releases were nearly double, but the flows in Vanderhoof were actually considerably, or just a fraction below average, but certainly well above minimum. Okay, so this is the chart that some people love it, some people hate it. I kind of like it because it shows me sort of everything in one foul swoop. So the way to read this chart here is, and this is the total water year that we saw last year. So as we were sitting there in November last year, the reservoir elevation is this first black curve. You can see that here, and it's plotted against over this side. And you can see that the reservoir elevation was right in sort of where a long-term average normal is. It sort of tracked down. It was slightly slower across the fall last year, and that was due to a low smelter load. And then we saw the spring come up. And I'll touch on that in a minute, but the spring come up. We got very close to a full reservoir this year, very, very close. And I'll touch on that again in a moment as well. And then we've seen it continuing to regress. But what this is also showing is reservoir inflows. So the inflows are plotted by this blue curve here that you see continuing to move up and down. That's the water flowing into the reservoir. And the way to read this chart here is the dark gray that sits below it is the 80 to 20 percentile range. So normally, 9 years out of 10, you'll sit there with, 6 years out of 10, you'll sit there with the water sitting in between this range here. As you look at the extremes, that's this light gray shaded area. So these are the highest and the lowest that we've ever seen on any given day. And then these two curves that sit over the top, one of them is the total discharge out of the reservoir. So that's Skins Lake Spillway plus what's leaving Kamano. And then you have Skins Lake Spillway just by itself in yellow there. And you can see that profile ramping up and then ramping back down. So notionally, if you're in the situation where the inflows are less than the discharge, the reservoir is going down. And then once you have inflows, this blue line above discharge, notionally your reservoir is going up. It's a fairly simple concept, but also always one worth reflecting on. So as I looked at 2022, it was an incredibly interesting year because as we got there in the end of March and as we did the 1st of May snowpack measurement, it was actually remarkably normal. It was a long-term average snowpack. Everything looked controlled. The inflows to the reservoir were sort of sitting there right along long-term average, and it sort of just held. Then what we saw is we actually saw the incredibly wet spring start. And it turns out it was the second wettest spring on record. And what that did is it had sort of inflows tracking, fairly nicely along long-term average, but it was also quite a late spring. So by the time we really saw that ramp up of the freshet, it was nearly the end of May. And that's when we saw, and I think there was actually one day where we did see some of the highest inflows that Nechako has ever seen. Obviously not quite as high as this. But we saw that continuing wet cyclone continuing to impact the Nechako system. And what that did is it drove the reservoir elevation up quite steeply. And we started to see that there was a risk of exceeding the flood cap and a risk that we would fill the reservoir before that water would curtail. So we did two things. One, we ended up working very closely with the Cheslada First Nation, and ultimately we worked with them. There was high water impacts in the Cheslada Lake area, and we did see that. But then we also worked with the District of Vanderhoof. We worked with the regional district, the water comptroller, and we all set about seeking an authorization to surcharge the reservoir so that notionally we could take more water in the reservoir if we continued to see that wet cycle persist. And so in order to do that, we need to demonstrate that there's no dam safety concerns, there's no risks, that we have an adequate management plan in place to ensure that there's daily monitoring to ensure that we don't have any dam safety risks. But basically what we saw is right at the end of July, it dried up. And it was quite stark. We basically went from incredibly wet to one of the driest cycles on record. So we didn't actually end up needing the surcharge in the reservoir, but it was close. And this is where you can see those inflows just plummet. And over the month of July, they plummeted all the way down and even to below long-term average. So, you know, we came all the way down to this point. And then over that summer, we continued to see low inflows all the way across. And you can see that in the fall in particular, that October and November, we've never seen anything like that. It was the driest on record. And normally in October, November, we're actually accumulating precipitation. So when you look at the total water year and the total balance, it was actually average. When you look at what we had to manage in real-time hydrology, we went from extremely wet to extremely dry. We dealt with extreme weather events and ultimately very extreme situations. And, you know, a lot of conversations with the District of Vanderhoof and the regional district across that summer period. So again, this just shows sort of the 2022 snowpack. Again, you could see that it was long-term average all the way across. We did accumulate snow later in the season, but what that was not actually sort of more precipitation. It was just still colder. So we were accumulating snow where typically we might be seeing the snowpack regress because of that warmer weather. 2022 Nechako River flows. So this is where you can see what the actual flows in the river were. So if we look at Vanderhoof, the blue chart, actually I'll start with the red one, which is Cheslada Falls. Basically, anytime water is flowing at more than 330 cubic meters per second at Cheslada Falls, we are seeing flood impacts in the Cheslada region. And then Vanderhoof, you can see that increase this year during the spring. And ultimately to its peak right in mid-July there, just below the 550 cubic meter per second flood cap this year. So again, we were monitoring that very closely and taking very active decisions to remain below that 550 cubic meters per second. And then what was interesting here is when we switched to that dry cycle, because we had so much water in the reservoir, we actually maintained spills longer than we normally would and at higher levels than we normally would. But the Nechako River just crashed, and it was all of those low-lying watersheds exhausting and draining at that time. A couple of other years just for interest. I thought we'd call out some of these other years. So 2015 was another year that some of you, I'm sure, will remember. We had a very high snowpack and very high inflows over the summer period. You can see that the inflows, it was accumulating water nearly across the whole winter period. So water continued to flow. It was quite warm, but it was also building a snowpack as well. So that when the spring started, there was this enormous inrush of water. And same thing, reservoir elevation was actually quite low in 2015, but that enormous volume of warm water and rain and snowpack really drove that huge peak into there as well. So you can see the 2015 snowpack here. That's what it looked like. And then you can see here in Vanderhoof, the flows in Vanderhoof up just under 700 cubic meters per second in 2015. So again, just starting to get a feel for how we see that hydrology work. 2007, an extremely high snowpack, incredibly high snowpack, which led to these enormous inflows during that spring period. And it was also very wet in 2007. So an enormous amount of rain on top of that snow, which ultimately drove the high flood impacts there. So you can see the snowpack there in 2007. And then you can see the flows at Vanderhoof just below 800 cubic meters per second. Okay, so what does that look like over history? So if we go all the way back to 1957, there's been 6 incidences of flooding or above the flood threshold. So it represents around a 9% likelihood on any given year. If we look at the last 30 years, we've had 2 events. So 2015 and 2007. So it's actually slightly less. It's around a 7% chance over the last 30 years. So again, when you start to see that, you know, in early days, without the smelter load and without Kamano running as it could, there were more incidents. More recently, we've only got the 2 there, 2007 and then 2015. 97 was close. I'm reminded of that regularly, but 97 didn't actually exceed 550 cubic meters per second. Just some snapshots. I won't cover this too much. I think Ian did a good job of showing these. But I'm a very visual person. I always like to keep coming back to these photos to understand, you know, what was that situation and what did it look like. So again, 2021, 2022, I just wanted to compare a little bit to the province. So, you know, we always look very closely at Vanderhoof and we always look very closely at the Nechako River. But a lot of times these weather patterns that we see, whether it's high snow or whether it's spring rain, don't only impact the Nechako system. We see them impacting a much broader area. So the Peace River systems, you know, and just this year, there was the atmospheric river system in Abbotsford, and that was the big event that hit the Fraser River. June this year, high stream flow advisories, same in Nechako, but all the way through the province. You could see, you know, Lower Fraser into Osoyoos, Kelowna, Salmon Arm, all the way through. And then even this year in October and November, we've seen high flow advisories in some of these as well. So again, it's always worth reflecting that there's big weather patterns and weather systems that can impact communities across the province. Right, last one. I touched on the ability to surcharge the reservoir before. It's a facility that's been applied for, I think, 8 times, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times we've actually needed to surcharge the reservoir. So you can see that provides us just that last little bit of breathing room in the event of high water persisting late into the summer. So, you know, 2015, 2007, 72, 71, and 68 were all years where the reservoir actually had more water in it than is the typical maximum operating range. Okay, and that's my last slide. It's always worth keeping in mind, and I remind myself of this all the time, that what happens at Skins Lake Spillway, that's the yellow curve, it actually takes significant time to impact Cheslata Falls and then Vanderhoof. So the example we use here is Skins Lake Spillway flows were reduced here. It didn't start in Vanderhoof till here. And that's nearly sort of 7 days later, 6 to 7 days later before you start to see it. So there's actually a lag between what happens in Skins Lake versus what happens here. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we have to manage in Vanderhoof, if there is a big rainstorm that happens while we are at those high stream flows, reducing spill doesn't necessarily answer the need to avoid that. So we're always dealing in those uncertainties. So last slide, this is my team that looks after all of these things. We have a series of analysts and researchers. Alec Mercier, who is this gentleman virtually in the middle, he is the full-time assigned to the Nechako River. Alec has been with us here in BC quite a lot. He spends quite a bit of time here in the summer most years. And then we have also now have Simon, who is here supporting Alec in doing a lot of the modeling for how do we continue improving flows into the future. And that's from the work that the Water Engagement Initiative is doing and the work that we're doing with First Nations as well. All right, that's it. I've covered a lot of ground, a lot of queries, a lot of terms. I will open up to any questions, any comments, any feedback, emotional outbursts, perhaps.
I do think it's worthy to mention UNBC and Stephen Berry.
Yeah, absolutely, Wayne. Sorry, I was remiss. So one of the challenges we are seeing, and I was actually reflecting on a conversation Kevin and I have had a number of times, is in my time in the last 6 years, there's been a number of unprecedented weather events. And what we're seeing across watersheds is what seems to be a changing climate impacting the profile and the volume of precipitation that falls. So we're actually working with UNBC, so University of Northern British Columbia. We have a joint funded climate change research chair and associated projects. And it's joint funding with Rio Tinto, NSERC, which is the National Research Council, and UNBC. All three of us are combined and conjoined funders of that. And basically what that provides us is an aggregation of all of the information and data. And then we're looking forward over the next couple of years to getting the readouts on that and seeing if that we can sensitize the modeling to provide better flow decisions in a changing climate environment. So I'm quite proud of that work. I'm obviously quite proud as well that it is the largest climate change study being done on a hydro watershed anywhere in North America at the moment. So it actually is getting looked at by a number of other universities and organizations as a roadmap for how we complete these studies.
Andrew, it's Ian. I'd just like to add that one of the things we worked on this summer with the big rain event there was the effects of the Notley watershed, which is uncontrolled by Rio Tinto and that type of thing. And we did see higher flows in the Notley than for a longer time than we ever did see, and that type of thing, which really affected some of the decisions that were made over this last year. It was just totally different than any other time that the Notley stayed that high. Part of what was discussed was because of the fires, the trees that have been gone, and that up in the hillside affected that groundwater, and that draining into the Fraser Lake system and that. So it's a real balancing act at certain times of the year.
No, it is. And look, the Notley's a very interesting one. And this year, the level of ground saturation that we saw in that Fraser Lake area was extreme. I got photos from a number of ranches out there where their hillsides have slipped, you know, people unable to move in tractors just from that level of saturation. And it was astounding how much water just continued to move into the system across the summer through the Notley, and how impactful that was. Similarly, I think it was 2017. There was an exceptionally high snowpack in the Notley, but a relatively average snowpack in the Nechako. And what we were able to do that year was withhold spills from the Nechako to allow the Notley watershed to exhaust. And it's typically a watershed that freshet runs earlier because it's a lower elevation, it gets warmer. And it could run out and exhaust. And as the Notley was coming down, we were then able to ramp up the Nechako and again, avoid those high water impacts in the region.
Very interesting. Thank you, Andrew, for all the information, and just wish you all the best and with your continued operations.
Thanks very much, Lyle. And look, as always, I'm always here, always interested in talking about the river and the reservoir. Certainly my contact details, Aman has them, and more than happy to provide further detail if you have queries moving forward. But thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, so next, a message from your fire chief, Ian Leslie. Ian, take it away.
Thanks. Well, I won't be very long here. It's a pretty short section for me itself, but just for the emergency part of the District of Vanderhoof, we monitor the river upstream and downstream of everything that's going on. We use 2 monitoring stations in Vanderhoof. One is at our bridge, and the new one that was installed after our last ice jam, it's on Bublitz's property on the north side of the river above Campbell Road area. And that is monitored and with an alarm system. So if we see any real definite change real rapidly in that, I will get a phone call and that type of thing, and we can take action on that. And we do have the district, we've come up with key river flow levels and that, so we know what to do when things get to those levels. So we respond to those trigger points. We work very closely when that happens with EMBC. Right away, we phone and get a task number with them. And this year, they were really good to work with. Our Gabion baskets were moved from Chilliwack to Prince George. Vanderhoof, we take 2.2 kilometers of Gabion baskets, and that to put in, as well as in Vanderhoof, we have 72,000 sandbags in inventory at this time. We also work closely with the River Forecast Center and that to determine and monitor these flows, and of course with Rio Tinto as well, and determining where we can go back and forth. We go from meeting every 2 weeks usually, and then it moves into a weekly, then daily, and sometimes even more than that if it's needed. We do have an emergency response plan in place. Our EOC at this time would be set up in the mezzanine of the arena, and that we work from there. We can work through from an evacuation alert to a notice, and then the mayor could put in a local state of emergency, which gives us other powers that we can move on to private land and that type of thing, and then also recover some of our costs back from the provincial government. Our key responsibility is to our residents to make sure that they're all safe, and that other than the ice jam, since 1976, the ice jam was the only time we had residents out of their homes. All the other flooding events down in Riverview, Victoria, residents have been able to stay in their homes. And also our next key responsibility will be for the key infrastructure. And all that has been taking place with the upgrading of the water treatment plant. That's all built to the latest 200-year floodplain, as well as our lagoon systems. And we have key points, flows that we sandbag our lift stations as well, and that type of thing. All our storm drains going into the Nechako have duckbills on the ends of them now, instead of just check valves that didn't really seal. Now we've had a big cost and that, and we took that on, and the municipality then had them installed. We have a response plan of what to do. Like I say, it falls under the emergency plan, and part of that would be installing the gabions and that, and our maps half up there. But we do have just the points of, we can talk about later on the map where we go and that type of thing. We bring in pumps to pump from the residential side of the gabion baskets and any diking that we put in and that type of thing, pumping that groundwater back out to maintain that level down. But it's a huge undertaking to do that, and then the recovery afterwards. Yeah, it's just what you see, what we spend in a short period of time is just massive, and then the recovery costs as well. And And that, so yeah, basically that covers it off, myself. And just while I'm speaking on Campbell Road area, I think when that area was developed, if I remember correctly, it was not under the District of Vanderhoof municipality at the time. It was regional district area. So and now it's fallen under us. So we've taken that in and now we're responsible for it as well.
I almost bought lot 5 from Frank.
I would have been all right.
I was like, I just don't need this problem.
Yeah, that's right.
And then you looked at that picture of your first home for $10,000 underwater. You went, nope.
I had 3 houses on the river, so I know this one.
But yeah, I'll put the key trigger points up if anybody wants to see it, and if anybody wants a copy, I can share it. It's not a problem, but we do have that. We meet with council quite regularly, sometimes daily, and that type of thing. But they're all informed as much as we can with what we know.
In your position, are you driven by the province or driven by the municipality when you're in a flood situation?
A lot of it changes over from the responsibility of the municipality to the EMBC takes over.
Okay.
Lyle and I have worked really close. I think a couple of times I almost ended up in jail. And in the recovery point, we made some decisions that a few people didn't like and things like that. Part of the walkway in Sandy Beach area was one of our big battle points with EMBC. Said they had to come out and we could dump the gravel on municipal property and then put it back if we wanted to. And we said, we're not going to absorb that cost. It can stay. And some things like that, yeah, at the heat of the moment, it's quite hot sometimes and dealing with some landowners and that. But once we declare a state of emergency, then we can have those residents removed as well. So we've never had to come to that point, and I hope we don't see it. I don't think I will. So
it is incredibly interesting that we can have somebody with a little bit of water on his lawn and he'll freak out.
Yeah.
And the other one will have water in his crawl space and we'll deal with it as if it's yesterday or tomorrow.
A lot of homeowners now, we deal with water in their crawl space. We just ask them to put a few gallons of bleach down there. Back in 2007, the worst ones to deal with was BC Housing. They started pumping out under their crawl spaces and basements, and it pumped all the sand out from underneath their homes, and they're all settled. But they wouldn't listen. So what do you do?
I listened after the first pillar disappeared.
We have some really good residents that we work with and that, and like I know I can drive into Wayne's place and walk across his property and go look at his gauge on the tree and that type of thing. And other ones will say, "Do not come on my property" and that type of thing. So, but yeah, if you guys have any questions, I hope I can answer them. But one way I've been fortunate, I was here in 1976 when Riverview flooded the first time. We had a D9 cat down there and 3 skidders stuck all at the same time. We were canoeing into people's homes, trying to get their stuff out and moving up onto the main floor. But
there wasn't very many houses.
No, there wasn't. That was when it was first started to be development.
Did we not, in fact, understand that we hadn't put a flapper gout? That was kind of part of the construction thing. Yeah. So the man who built the subdivision, he had the drainage pipes for the ditch lines to go out, but he didn't put a flapper valve, and so it came in. And that's how the water actually got into the subdivision.
In 1976, I was one of the kids that was diving down trying to put the basketballs into the drainage pipes.
Emergency response.
Yeah, that was the last thing when I was at Public Works. We took out those flapper valves and put what we call duck bills. They're curved. They go on the end of the pipes. They're real thick, heavy rubber, about 3/4 of an inch thick. The curved side of it faces upstream, so as the river flow increases, it makes them tighter closed. And if the water backs up in on the drainage side, it'll actually push and let the water back out. They work fantastic. Very little maintenance and that type of thing with them. But
It was, we had a flood, but it was a subdivision design problem.
Yeah.
That's really important for us to remember.
And like everybody's mentioned and Lyle's mentioned here, one of their biggest things is the groundwater. And that type of thing, certain times of year. I've had an asphalt paver stuck on the corner of Butte and Stewart Street due to the high water, ground saturation and that type of thing. So we get groundwater within 2 feet of the surface at certain times of the year. We've dealt with sinkholes in the community as well, and we relate that back to the groundwater as well.
It's really interesting too, because there's a lot of places, and I never talk about my house in relationship to the community. That's my problem, not the community's problem. My house was built in 1972 under a 50-year floodline, and now we're a 200-year floodline. So I was approved by every level of government to build that house, or some dude was, right? And they did. And then you buy it and you feel really good for decades. And then all of a sudden you have nothing but problems thereafter. The government has responsibility, but in the fact of the matter is, it's kind of just a roll of the cards. It's a roll of the dice, right? It's just how it is. Period. I thought I was the only person in this community who built a cement wall in front of his house to keep the river out, but I take it from Lyle that there's a couple of other people that have.
Some people are starting to react to that, yeah.
But
They have it.
we're not going to build a dike in front of my house, but that wall actually does what the dike is, and it's 4 inches wide, 5 inches wide, or something like that. But it's 30 feet. No, it's 20 feet down. So I really have something that's there. It's much more affordable than the diking system. You couldn't build a dike for what I paid for that there. So, you know, it does, there's other ways of dealing with this, but my cement wall is also ornamental. It's aggregate, it's got lights on it, it's attractive. It doesn't look like a cement wall. It is, but it isn't.
I mean, it can't compete with those beautiful cars in front of our place. What year did those go in? I'm just curious.
Those are all, yeah, we put in the 50s.
50s.
But see, when we went to move those out of there, that became a problem for somebody,
sure.
right?
Well, and I can see it. It would be very invasive to move, shift it. But that was why when I was asking about the levels, because I've never seen it, like there was parts of the cars that we'd never seen before that were exposed this fall, right? And there's a tire, like an actual, like, So the 50s is when they went in,
So,
just to stop the erosions back in the 50s, that's when it started.
We had a couple of young boys drowned, and one of them, after drowning, went into one of those vehicles. The catchment for everything.
So we've had some very ingenious flood response methods, I see. Very interesting. But sometimes, we have to exercise some ingenuity to deal with these situations too. And you can only use what resources you've got sometimes. And I could tell you several stories of things that I did in the past that I had to do to save some money. But I won't. So thanks, Ian, for your presentation, and we'll continue on with Wayne. If you're ready, you can take it away. And
Ethan, did you get my pictures this time around?
I did.
Nice. Ian, we struggle us too.
Yes.
Just pop up. There's only two, and it's really simple. We're going to talk about Species at Risk Act, sturgeon, and then I'd like to touch base on salmon, although they're not a SARA species. It's really important. So everybody who lives in our community knows about this girl. Period, the Nechako white sturgeon is SARA listed. The SARA listing started, and I actually had to go back and remind myself, in 2000, we recognized that there was a challenge, there was a problem. And then over the next years, we built a plan. Interestingly enough, Species at Risk Act is a federal law. There is usually something everywhere in the world, and I ask people who come to the hatchery, somebody from Denmark was here yesterday, day before, they have something, he wasn't sure what it was called, but they worry about species at risk. The concept is we don't want anything to go extinct, It's just about as simple as that. So we have levels of indicators for us. I think I'm the last person to have legally caught one of those sturgeons as a fisherman. A man knocked on my door, said, how many do you catch? How often do you catch them? And then the key question was, how many small ones do you ever catch? And I said, we're fishing for big fish. We're not fishing for little guys. Why would you ask that? And he said, you've been fishing for 20 years and you've never caught a small sturgeon. Did that intrigue you? And it actually hadn't. I was fishing for big fish. And I hadn't rationalized the issue that was there. So we have indicators in society. We start off by saying, hey, there's not very many butterflies around here. Somebody says, well, they're kind of yellow. We should be a little bit worried. And then we get into a blue and say, hey, I haven't seen a butterfly for a month. And then we get into red or endangered. And they say, oh my God, we're really going to do something about it. And so at that point, they Sarah listed them, and it goes kind of interestingly enough at special concern, threatened, endangered. So that's the red issue. Extirpated, which means there's some around, but it's fundamentally biologically dead. You've got too many brothers and sisters left, not enough diversity in the populations, and then extinct. And so extinction is the issue that we're conscious of and we're always worried about. Where Sarah comes in is that this fish has a recovery strategy. That recovery strategy talks about water, volumes of water, a critical habitat, important habitat, needed habitat. And that is really an important conversation when we're dealing with an industry like Rio Tinto. They have legal obligations to look after this species, period. And so that sort of sets us up with how much water we want, what time of the season that we think it's critical, etc. So we have a lot of good people in our community and our province who think if Rio Tinto would just open the gates up, everything would be fine. We would flush all of the badnesses out of the system and we would have nothing but cobbles and gravel and we'd have sturgeon spawning, successfully recruiting. We have asked Northwest Hydraulics, which is kind of the main company in British Columbia, does most of the work on the Nechako, what that number is. And so you've heard Andrew talk about the 60 cubic meters that we have right now. We break the bank in downtown Vanderhoof at 550, and Northwest Hydraulics has suggested the number required would be between 1,100 and 1,200 cubic feet per second to agitate the river bottom enough to create the cobbles, to create the structure, the hidey holes for the egg set itself. And 1,100 would flood you back to 4th Street. So the whole town would be underwater at that level. Just to put it into some segments and some perspective of what we're about. No matter how many times we tell that story, it's repeated, it's asked, it's a frustrating issue that is there, period. Maybe quickly flip over to the other one here, and although it's just a wonderful picture of a salmon. So this is my passion. Interestingly enough, even though I chair the community working group, this is more my passion because of the direct relationship to this fish and salmon and sturgeon recovery. So this species here, we're losing them all across the world. Climate change hasn't been helpful, but in British Columbia, all of our species are here. So if I give you that word extinction, and I told you about extirpation, on the Nechako River, we are now left with, over the counts that we've had in the last few years, one fish. I actually had one female salmon returned only. We have a fence up and we monitor it 24 hours a day. That's extinction. It doesn't matter that she made it back. We've had 6, we've had 8, and 1 year we had 32, but it's extirpated. It is biologically dead. In the Nechako River, the mud river, you cross that going into Prince George. We used to have 1,000 spawning salmon in there. We have 6. We had 8 1 year. We just caught a fry the other day. We were jumping around being silly. We caught a fry in a seine net. We were looking for it. it was a eureka, oh my God, we got a fry. One fish. But it said something, because it said something, period. The Nechako salmon, and this is really, where it's really interesting. We have 7 species of salmon in North America. We have 5 that we are responsible for, but we have over 520 families of fish that are different. So we have in our Chinook populations in Vanderhoof, we have what we call a 5-2 and a 5-1. So it spends 5 years in the oceans, 2 years in the Nechako system. Those are the real big Chinook salmon. They are the favorite food of the SARA-listed southern killer whales, orca whale populations. They prefer our fish over all others because of size, body fat, et cetera, et cetera. 5-2 fish are naturally really large. In days of old, before contact, orcas would eat 2 or 3 of those 5-2s because they were in the 80 to 100 pound size. And now they're in the 20 pound size, and they're all 20 pounds. It's like you can't find hardly anything different in that issue that is there. So now an orca whale has to hunt maybe 100 times harder than he used to hunt in order to get the same kind of food. I give you some really quick numbers. Greer Creek, my friend whose mom and dad has had the place since the 60s, grew up as a son. He said when he was 13 years old, he would on occasion pitchfork Chinook salmon out of Greer Creek. When asked why, it's because he was 13 years old. But we had them in Greer Creek at that time. We also had, for his whole life on the farm, 100 to 200 sockeye salmon in Greer Creek, which is an unusual issue. We all know, if you know something about salmon, that salmon go through a stream and live in a stream above a lake. They hatch, they come back in, they live in that lake. But what we have discovered over time is that they actually will live in rivers. And so you get a big wide spot in a river, like the Big Eddy, and they think they're actually in the lake, and they think they've fulfilled that, and they turn right and go up, they turn left and go up Greer Creek, and they do that. This year, when we were in the upper Nechako, we saw over 1,000 sockeye, which is totally unusual. Like, that's big, big numbers for us. Period. So a really exciting issue that is there. Period. But this animal here, although the Nechako white sturgeon is expensive and it costs us, the taxpayers, between $800 and $1 million a year forever, or for 50 years until we recover that population, it's an important issue to remember that that money no longer goes to your granny for cancer treatments, to your dad for a hip replacement, because it's going to that fish. If we get to a point in history where we SARA-list these creatures, we are going to have economic chaos across the province. We are going to be so restricted in what we can do, how we can do it. I personally believe the only reason that we haven't SARA-listed salmon right now is the politicians are fighting and pushing it back hard on this aspect because they understand the economic chaos. The early Stewart runs in the upper Stewart River there at one time, 20 years ago, were worth $100 million a year to the province. And we've had 2 nice runs, 200,000, 300,000. We used to have 2 million, 2 million. And so if this ever happens to us, we're in trouble. And one of the things the province of British Columbia is trying to do is get SARA to be a provincial entity, so it's not governed by the feds. My initial reaction was that's because you want to control it, and I don't like this, but my actual educated is we actually could then start to dictate what's going on, and we would be in much more control. The federal government has the ability of telling the province that you must do this, but they give you $0. So when they told us we must recover the Nechako white sturgeon, they give us $0, and it took us a decade to raise $10 million. And it was a hard 10 million to get. Period. Rio Tinto wasn't the company then that they are today that contributes somewhat lovingly. Are you still on, Andrew? Somewhat lovingly.
Yep, still here.
I'm on his eyes.
That's too new to the company. But yeah, so that's the two things. And so when we talk about water and water issues, if frazzle ice is bad at 60 cubic meters per second, I'm actually behind the door fighting for 60 cubic meters because we think that's what we need to put it onto the reds in order to get the salmon population, to get the outputs that are there. And I'm totally conscious of this 60 centimeter frazzle ice conversation. But again, it's a work in progress. It's a conversation, and we're lucky that we actually can have it. We're really lucky that we can be having these conversations because there's lots of times this is dictated to us, right? Like the forest policy of overlogging and harvesting in British Columbia. Well, anyway, that's kind of it. Any questions?
So interesting. What was the returns in the Skeena system this year? Do you know?
The reason I do what I do is because I want them to fix the scheme, and I hope there's some other arsehole over there that's doing what we're doing here, so I can go back and fix.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
But no, I don't know. We're in trouble. This is climate change is the largest thing that we've kind of chosen to ignore. This council here funded a climate change study, I think 12, 15 years ago. It said definitively, you guys are going to be growing grapes and corn in the future, right? You're not going to be needing potatoes and cabbages. You're going to grow. And yet we have an industry who logs a pine, plants a pine. We have massive fires after massive fires after massive fires, and we get some arsehole wants to plant them back up to log them in 100 years. And we need them to be what they are, burnt out valleys that have grasslands and savannas, and Bambi running around in them. So yeah.
Well, sounds good. Thank you, Wayne, for the interesting conversation, and hopefully our fisheries value can be maintained. That's something that we look forward to. So,
Andrew, did you hear the nice words I said about your company?
I did. I really appreciated them, Wayne.
Maybe you had gone off.
You just wait till the camera's off.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He wouldn't have said it if I was there.
right on. Well, thank you very much. And lastly, we'll welcome your new mayor, Kevin Moutray. And Kevin, we look forward to your comments.
Awesome. So I'm actually going to cut this super short. I'm supposed to have 15 minutes, but I'll get us back on track so we can hear loud because everybody can hear me all the time. You know where to find me. You know the questions to ask. I just want to quickly go over some of the points. Lila talked about 2008 was the last flood mapping that was done. We believe we're going to have new flood mapping next year, which is interesting, but probably won't change the conversation a super amount, right? 2010, there was a flood mitigation plan done by Urban Systems, and looking at the Sandy Beach area, where there would be a more permanent dike base in that plan that would then be either sandbagged or gated on top of, as well as the backside of Reed Drive. Then after that, I want to say it was 2013, we got funding from the province actually to build the one at the end of Sandy Beach Road. Unfortunately, landowners were not cooperative, so that project never happened, and we actually had to give the money back to the province without doing anything with it, which is always a really sad thing to do when you fight hard for that funding.
One landowner or multiple? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of where that, and it's kind of been on the, I want to say on back burner is the wrong word. It's been on council's agenda, but hard to push forward until you find a solution for that. But then we looked at events like last year in Merritt. You know, it's time to get this back in the conversation and time to get it back looking at what we can do. So that's why we really want to get this group together. Small group today, we are recording it so we can, hopefully everybody's good with us sharing it for informational purposes so we can get the word out there. We do have it there. One of the groups working on this is a committee of council. So right now committees expired with the last council and will be reformed. Most probably a good chance to be the same people. But if you're interested in being on any of the DOV's committees, Ethan is the guy to talk to in the corner there. It's a great way to get a bit of a chance to get your feet into doing some of this stuff and planning out how you want to see your community go. So Environment Committee, I'll just talk quickly. The past one was myself. I won't be there anymore. John Murphy was on there. Obviously won't be there anymore either. Councillor Franco, Wayne, Zoe Dillon, Dana Stark, and for this one, we tried something really new and brought a high school student in. So we had Siobhan Clausen in, which worked really great. I'm really hoping more of our committees we can get an engaged high school student on, because it's great for them to get that experience too in working with local government. But I'm going to leave it there and turn back to you, Lyle, so we can get back on track. I was supposed to end at 3:20, so I'm 3 minutes over.
Can I make one comment from a municipal standpoint? I appreciate how we handle this. I've been on every flood. It was my unit crew that was in 2007 doing most of the work. One of the things that happened after the flood, and it's always that recovery issue, when we pulled all the gabions up, we left new soil, new dirt, new everything. And if you would come to Reed Drive with me someday, I'd like to walk you through and show you every species of invasive plant in the world that showed up. And it showed up along those gabion footprints where we left all that bare soil. And
Because there was all kinds of stuff in there.
Absolutely, it can't flush down the system and it came in there. And so the District of Vanderhoof should have grass seeded everything that is there. And now it's not where the gabions were. It's our whole subdivision is just a mess of, and some noxious, nasty shit. What do they call it? Dalmatian toad flag. But there's just so much of that stuff that's there. So the flood was horrible, but for 30 years afterwards, I see all these weeds.
About 9 days a year.
And we're an agricultural community, and that's really the premise of it. Not only do we have yards and gardens, but we're an agricultural community, and we spread that shit all the way through the valley because of it. Part of the next steps.
And maybe before you take over, Lyle, I will just quickly say thank you to yourself, to Ian, to Wayne, to Andrew online. Thanks for presenting today. This has been really great information, and I'm looking forward to what we can do. And to you, Lyle, for the last mile.
Oh, thank you very much. You're doing great. I get used to calling you the mayor of Moosetree now.
Quite a mouthful, isn't it? Mayor of Moosetree.
Well, I'm going to just keep it short too, and just say that I just encourage all of us to together and look to the future in a positive way, and see what we can do to make this community more resilient to flood events, which we're talking about. And there's fisheries values to think about, there's human values, environmental values. And I think if we work together and bring all groups together, we can come up with a pretty good balanced plan for the future. So I just look forward to that in a positive way. And I just thank you all for your presentations and for coming out. And I thank you for the invite to just talk away here. And I just say that I just appreciate everybody for coming out. And so just hope that you all have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Awesome. As a new council member, and Dave as well, I found this incredibly enlightening because I've known Wayne and what he's been doing. I've worked with Ian before, but when you don't sit on the front lines and people don't come out to meetings like this and they don't know, it's really enlightening to learn this. So I'm really glad that I'm getting started in this. I've had an opportunity to come and get enlightened by it all. So thank you guys all for your presentations. So, and I do want to wander your weeds with you.
Yeah, you know, the challenge of being flooded is really interesting. I mean, being a wildland firefighter, I grew up not being scared because the scared firefighters aren't good firefighters. I grew up not being scared. And so when they told us we were going to flood in 2007, my wife said, well, are we moving? Are we? I said, no, we'll cowboy up and we'll just hang in here, right? And so we put one wall of sandbags in there that were, 4.5, 5 feet tall. And then they come along and said, gee, we don't think that's gonna hold it. So we put another wall in there, period. And then I put a pump underneath my house. And I heard the story, don't pump it out, but Jesus Christ, there's water under my house. I'm pumping it out. So I pumped it out and the pillar slipped out there. And I'm not swimming in my crawl space, but I'm kind of going, oh my God, look what I did, right?
Yeah.
I have a furnace in my crawl space, so I pull my furnace out every time and I put it back in. I pull the guts out, not the carcass, right? It cost me $400 to do it every damn time. Period. And then the water disappeared, and so did all my friends. Not one person said, Jesus, we'd love to help you take And my wife, after 60 days of doing it, I actually disliked my neighbor who watched me with a can of beer in there. And so I said to my wife passionately, we'll do this twice. We won't do this, right? And so then the second flood comes. And now I'm not that tough of a cowboy anymore. Oh my God, I don't want to do this again. And I hadn't even learned to like my neighbor yet. And so I said to my wife, I'm going to take some of the family money and build us a wall, because I don't really want to move. It is actually freaking tough mentally to be in a flood. It's different than a fire. I can run from fires. Floods are kind of. Yeah, we need to do something. I think during Lyle's era, though, you guys said you have to build a dike around every place in the community, and I think we have to really dike those places that we can, and we have to adapt and have a wall like we did in ours. And we only have 2 properties in all of Reed Drive that are a problem.
Well, actually, I sort of promote a combination of things.
Yeah.
So there are some areas that are very critical that really should be done.
Yeah, I need it.
And then there are some areas where, landowners can engage in self-roofing their own house by their own means, with a berm or wall or whatever the case, decorated out. And then there are some cases where the floodway should be reclaimed. So there's a whole combination of things that could happen, and it's going to require a lot of project management to make that happen. So you almost need like a project manager to make the process unfold. So if you want a dike and as opposed to a community that a dike be built, okay, then you got to get your conceptual design costs. You got to do a cost benefit analysis, because if the dike costs more than homes,
what do you do?
That's a negative cost benefit. So if you have homes that are worth, say, 50 million and your dike is worth 2 million, that's a very positive cost benefit. So you've got to look at all those things from all angles. And so you sort of look at all the different kinds of options that you can exercise. And then you can come up with a really nice balanced plan, and everybody can win in the long run. But it takes a lot of work and a lot of organization and cooperation amongst everybody. That's for sure.
And I think companies like Rio Tinto have matured into the understanding that they're not going to look good in the corporate world if they have a rigid process. And I like how we handle this conversation with Rio Tinto today. Decades ago, that was awful. It was like they were screw you. It's a high water event. Don't worry about it.
Well, also, just to add to that, years ago, it used to say 200 homes, who cares?
Yeah. It costs the province
200 homes, doesn't cost us nothing. Flood them. Nowadays, it's, we get a little pushback and that type of thing, and it's a lot easier. I even found, like I mentioned earlier, this year with EMBC, I picked up the phone and said, hey, there's a possibility we're going to get to these numbers. Okay, we'll start moving stuff for you. Let us know. I had a task number in 2 hours. If we needed to move ahead, that was already in place. They understand in Vanderhoof, we cannot put Gabion baskets in the last few days before we're getting there. We cannot get equipment on that soil and that type of stuff. We've fought it. We brought in specialized dump trucks with tracks and everything. We did it, sat back and had water up against them. And the last time we did it, we put them in in less than a week, we put in 2.2 kilometers of gabions, set back and watched the water come up, and it was a very relaxed time, actually. You know, that pressure was off. You know, back in 07, we had people up to their waist walking through water, packing one sandbag at a time, you know, and that type of stuff in the mud, you know, community residents, and with BC wildfire and stuff like that, the project was accomplished and maintained. But nowadays, the average homeowner, you're on your own. We'll deliver sandbags to your driveway and a load of sand. There you go. The whole thing is all taken and come back because now of work safe and everything else. You know, to do something like that, everybody has to sign in, sign out. You cannot just go and help. You can go walk across the street and hopefully help your neighbor, you know, in some cases. But as far as something organized and that type of thing, we've even had firefighters and my guys, we sandbagged Riverside Park and we got raked over the coals by EMBC for sandbagging parkland. And that caused a major conflict for quite a while during that event.
That park is special though. It's actually a barometer. When the park's flooded, you're screwed.
Okay.
Let's keep the park.
Yeah. And just a last comment, if everybody wants to understand something, if Kenny Dam ever burst or the spillway, the best place to be would be at the airport in Vanderhoof. Everything else is going to be underwater. So if you see that red pickup headed north.
From what I gathered, you're already being there.
Yeah, I didn't really notice.
I'm not stopping at the airport, I'm up 10 Mile Hill.
Yeah, that's right. Go to the top of 10 Mile Hill and watch it. And that type